public lands projects that have impacts to fish and wildlife. And, you know, we use litigation when we have to stop illegal projects and policies that harm public resources. But we also believe in proactively working to improve those policies and projects by encouraging our agencies to design, you know, beneficial restoration projects. So we believe that the best use of collaboratives is really to advance those goals of ecological restoration within agreed upon sideboards. And the point of collaboration isn't really to avoid objections or litigation on projects or to get timber volume out, but rather to craft projects, you know, together in a collaborative manner that benefit the forests and the watersheds that are in need of restoration after decades of overlogging, excessive road building, fire suppression, and other types of ecological degradation. And collaboration can be really useful in accomplishing these goals because it offers a means to finding common ground among diverse interests, community members, all, you know, who have a stake in how public lands are managed, and actually lead to projects on the ground with ecological benefits, you know, much like the rest of you have just mentioned. Because our main goal is these ecological outcomes. Success means that, you know, we want to see agencies considering and incorporating clear ecological outcomes in projects that the collaborative is engaged in, kind of like Laura just said, you know, kind of having those things spelled out from the get-go. So for example, on the Siuslaw National Forest, I'm actually going to advance a slide here, where for years we've called it the Siuslaw model of working together to restore old forest habitat, and we've got sideboards in place there based on the Northwest Forest Plan that are pretty constraining as far as what the National Forest can do. It's all about restoring old forest habitat for threatened species. So we have those sideboards in place, and you know, in order to be successful, we need to be able to model, measure, and monitor and learn from what we're doing on the ground to take into future projects. And so, you know, the success is really kind of a cycle of, you know, working together to design projects with ecological outcomes, like, you know, are we creating snags? Are our prescriptions for these young plantations getting the variability that we desire to, you know, to get the forest to grow back into, you know, to have diverse habitat structures? You know, is the vegetation responding favorably to get our results? And then feed that back into projects we design in the future. And so it can be a long-term process to figure out whether we're being successful with those ecological outcomes. And you know, coincidentally, timber volume is produced on the Siuslaw National Forest and is really easily measured, but is just a byproduct of, you know, the work that is being done otherwise. There are other things that we aim to get out of successful collaboration, but they're harder to measure, right? Pretty subjective. Things like feeling heard and valued and respected as a partner in the collaborative process. And for us, I guess in the end, as far as determining the value of collaboration, we want to see better ecological outcomes through the collaborative process than if we were just participating in, you know, as a member of the public through NEPA. And often we do see that, and sometimes we don't. And so when you're left with a balance of we're not really seeing many better ecological outcomes through collaboration, it can be those intangible things like having trusted partnerships and relationships that kind of tip the balance, you know, towards doing it or away from doing it. Okay, so I think I will stop my introduction there. We've all kind of talked generally here about successful collaborative outcomes for our organizations, but I want to hit on some specific examples of successful projects. So I don't care who goes first. I'll just put it out there to the group here of panelists. If you can give an example and of a successful project from a conservation perspective. and maybe describe what enabling factors helped make it a success. Anyone want to jump in there?
I'd actually like to describe more of a hypothetical successful project through describing the process by which it goes, which would be the enabling factors. I think what can help make a project successful is starting by collaborating incredibly early in the project, right after project initiation, to have to make sure that you're helping develop the purpose and need. And Laura touched on this a little bit, and that is making sure that the wildlife biologists and the fisheries biologists, maybe even the botanists, are helping to actually drive the project instead of just having the silviculturists drive the project is an incredibly important component to make sure that we have successful outcomes for conservation in these projects. And so in doing so, you're making sure that the outcomes are actually, like, say, for example, like you have outcomes such as improving lynx habitat or something like that, or doing a beaver dam analog or something as part of the project, instead of just doing silviculture or fuels reduction, which are valuable things for ecological forest restoration, but they're not the complete picture of everything that we would want. Along with that, making sure that during that process of collaborating early and often is that communication is flowing both ways between the public agency as well as the collaborative on the ground. So making sure that interests and concerns are heard from both parties. Sometimes what can happen is that at least from a collaborative perspective, it feels like, which may not be the actual case, but it feels like that the agencies are more communicating to explain what they're doing instead of communicating to listen and understand the concerns of interest of the collaborative. So through that process, having all those things in place, that can help produce a really successful project. And I'll stop right there because I don't want to take up too much time.
No, that's great. If we're able to come back to any specific examples, we can get there. But yeah, Michael or Laura, do you have? I mean, it can be hypothetical because that's kind of where I was going to go too. But specifics are great too. And what helped you get there?
Yeah, I can go. I think in terms of the hypothetical and the enabling factors, I really agree with a lot of stuff that was just said. I think that starting with that recipe of a real willingness to take things slow and keeping things simple and starting the conversations early, having really, those clear expectations about what's negotiable in the project that you're talking about. And I think having funding for non-timber projects is it's a very important component. And the back and forth communication that was just mentioned, I think, is really important. Especially, I want to echo with the Forest Service resource specialists, but I think as well as forest leadership too. I think having strong forest leadership that is aware and supportive of the collaborative groups and the things that they're exploring that are maybe a little bit outside the box can be really helpful. And then getting out into the field together always helps. But I'll just mention a couple really quick examples. Again, I have kind of an easier time thinking about like successful parts of projects or process, but one example that I can think of was the Wasco County Forest Collaborative successfully helped plan the Rocky project, which is out on the east side of Mount Hood, which is it's primarily a fuels project in the WUI that used Joint Chiefs funding, or is using Joint Chiefs funding, so partnership funding, to plan mostly non-commercial activities like hand thinning and prescribed fire and road closures. And that project had a pretty rushed start at the beginning when the Forest Service put out scoping as the collaborative group was just kind of finalizing its charter, but the group was really successful in kind of reeling that in and really committed to slowly have the conversations that were needed to be able to give good recommendations, and the Forest Service was willing to play along with that. So, and BARC really ended up finding a lot of common ground and building relationships with other collaborative members like at ODF&W, who were really pushing for a reduction in the open road network and prescribed fire. And then the group since that time, has been able to apply a lot of those same recommendations to other similar projects since we were given that initial deep time together to be able to really make them and kind of understand their value elsewhere. And then I'll just say one more thing about the specialists and an example with that. I think that that's really, really helpful, having communication and field time with Forest Service specialists. And that's been, it's been really helpful in the Clackamas Stewardship Partners, especially, namely in the North Clack project area, where there was some beaver restoration that was incorporated into that project, which BARC was really excited about and involved with. And so, you know, those specialists, they're not always at the collaborative table, which is really unfortunate. And they have some really, really great ideas and could sometimes really use more of a mouthpiece in these groups to generate the kind of interest and support that they need within their agencies. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, I think
Michael.
good point that, you know, I experienced working for the Forest Service is, you know, when I was thinking about examples of successful projects, the one that came to mind first for me was another Joint Chiefs project that took place that we called East Face. And as part of that project, we were lucky enough to have a bunch of data from a research project that had been done in there years before, where they had actually trapped and collared marten. And so we had telemetry data of how the marten were using the landscape. And I'm going to call out a group, the Greater Hells Canyon Council, who was participating on the collaborative then, was really beating the drumbeat of connectivity. Every meeting, they would bring it up. And so, you know, I worked with them. We put out marten cameras in the area, and we were able to design much better landscape scale between watersheds, connectivity, based off of the data that we had, which illustrated how they were using the landscape, but also because, you know, they brought it up enough that it just kind of seeped into people's heads. And so maybe there was kind of some little C collaboration going on between the specialists and interested groups, but the fact that they were part of the collaborative and kept bringing it up made it feel like it already was a done deal. Like, of course, we're going to be doing this. And since that point, within, you know, that district's purpose and need, connectivity has been one of the factors. And so to me, the enabling factors there were data for sure. And I think that's important. And that's one of the things with, I think the Joint Chiefs projects often feel more successful, and it's because there's more money in there and we can get more stuff done. But also the advocacy of the group of just bringing it up over and over and over again. And even if other people didn't think it was that important, they knew it was going to get brought up. And so when it appeared in the purpose and need, it wasn't a surprise. And we just kind of continued from it there. So yeah, I think that advocacy made a difference there, and it carried forward.
Laura, do you think, like, from, you know, as an agency specialist in that circumstance, do you feel like you wouldn't have been able to get connectivity into the purpose and need without the, you know, the voice of the collaborative and in particular you named GHCC in that case, or do you think, you know, you would have been able to fight, you know, as a wildlife biologist, you know, for that on your own?
I think in this particular case, I give a lot of credit to the district ranger on the LeGrand district. He's a very, I guess, holistic, restoration-minded type of ranger. And so I think that, yes, I personally would have been. However, having experienced different personalities and how different districts are run, I do think having the support like that from the outside advocacy groups really makes a difference. You know, if you can bring that to your ranger and say, we know that these groups really think this is important, and this is how we can build that into the project area based off of this data and this literature, that absolutely makes a difference.
Thanks. Yeah, I think that's sort of one of the things I was going to bring up for an enabling factor of success too, is, yeah, having the leadership or having the support from the leadership of the Forest Service or the agency you're working with. One example I was going to give was with the Southern Willamette Forest Collaborative. We went through a process sort of on a parallel track with the ID team to do a landscape level analysis, the Rigdon landscape analysis. So it wasn't NEPA, it was just a landscape analysis process that the collaborative went through, again, on a parallel track with the Forest Service IDT. And sometimes there were joint meetings, but there was a lot of joint learning that happened, you know, so that specialists were brought into the collaborative, and like the collaborative perspectives were reflected back to the IDT as this landscape analysis was going on. And that definitely wouldn't have happened without the commitment of the ranger to, you know, make sure that the IDT members were spending that time and valuing the input of the collaborative. And in this case, you know, it being a landscape level analysis, it's going to inform many projects down the line. You know, there's going to be like 4 or 5 EISs coming out of that landscape level analysis. And the collaborative group developed zones of agreement through that, you know, after that process sort of concluded, that hopefully will inform, you know, all of those NEPA assessments that come out. And so doing it kind of at that higher level and early on, I think we'll see better results on the ground because it's kind of going to be baked in. It's not, you know, the collaborative involvement isn't coming in at the last minute. So I think others of you mentioned that too, that getting, or Tiana especially, yeah, getting in early and baking in the concepts that you know, that we value from the conservation side is really important. I think you guys all covered the other things I was going to mention. I already kind of talked about how on the SAIS law, we have sideboards in place that just kind of on a policy level with the Northwest Forest Plan. And that really helps, you know, both constrain the work the collaborative, you know, recommends, or the Forest Service, you know, proposes. But in the case of the SAIS law, it gives us room to like, I don't know, get a little bit more down in the weeds in the discussions we have, because we're not talking about, I'm like, well, should we thin plantations? It's more, you know, how do we get the best results? Because we already know that that's the only work that, you know, is going to get done. Actually, that's not true. I should take that back. Oh, there's lots of other watershed restoration sort of work getting done as well. But as far as the vegetation management, there's no, you know, controversial logging in old stands, for example, because of the sideboards placed on the on that forest. And that helps us be successful. We don't have to fight about some of those things that in other places you might. So there's some great examples of success, but I know that we've all probably seen some challenges as well. And and so I wanted to see if you could offer some examples of challenges that your collaboratives have faced in meeting, you know, non-timber outcomes. You know, I know funding is one that we all might mention. It's been mentioned already. How do we pay for things like prescribed fire or stream restoration or other non-commercial outcomes? And I guess, you know, if you could talk about how your collaborative might have tried to address these challenges, or ideas you have for how we might address those challenges moving forward.
I can go. So definitely over the last few years, especially, I've definitely seen kind of a lack of the agency capacity and funding, like you mentioned, to consider non-timber projects outside of sometimes being coupled with really large timber sales. You know, I think as well as funding, there's a real lack. There has been, especially under the Trump administration, a real lack of metrics for the agency to be able to measure success other than, you know, acres treated and timber volume produced. So when they're expected to plan these projects really quickly, it seems like a lot of those things end up falling by the wayside, at least compared to what we would like to see. And I guess an example that I would bring up would be the Waukoma project area, where we saw some challenges related to that. So the Hood River Forest Collaborative Group did a lot of work independently in the beginning from the Forest Service to identify some opportunities to promote some non-motorized recreation opportunities through like things like road to trail conversions and stuff like that. And, you know, unfortunately, the group kind of went on with these conversations, only to later find out that that type of work was outside of the scope and the purpose and need for this project, that the Forest Service had since kind of come up with independently from the collaborative group. So that was definitely a frustrating experience for some folks that have been part of that collaborative for a long time and were kind of excited about starting things a little bit differently. I think there's hope for things like that to happen again successfully, which we'll probably get into. But I also want to say, you know, there are these larger integrated resource projects that the Forest Service plans that can include a suite of restoration activities kind of alongside what's often a lot of logging. But I've really observed that it's often pretty difficult and unrealistic to address all the moving parts of those sometimes really large, like landscape scale projects at one time. And so it's kind of like, that's one example of sort of like the quote unquote pace and scale really being at odds with group process and just the collaborative process in general. And, you know, with the increased timber targets that happened under the last administration and before, you know, these groups really have been expected to deliberate on larger, oftentimes more controversial projects faster. And even if they do include some really good parts like, you know, salmon habitat restoration or road decommissioning, you know, if those controversial parts aren't fully understood and addressed by the collaborative members or disclosed late into the process, which has happened sometimes, they can really take up all the focus of the group, especially if they don't have like sideboards, like Chandra was just saying. They can really take up a lot of time at the end, and some of the other project components can really end up falling by the wayside. And yeah, there's other stuff too, but maybe I'll stop there for now.
It's interesting that you brought up the, you know, the big integrated vegetation management projects, because that is the case in some places where those are still being planned. I'm thinking about some BLM projects, for example, in Southwest Oregon, not as part of a collaborative, but they're really big, and the NEPA is kind of like, I don't know, not very site specific, let's say, and probably wouldn't be meet the standards many of us are putting out there for projects we, you know, could get behind necessarily. Again, they're not being planned collaboratively, but I've actually seen a shift away from some of those. I think the Forest Service calls it big gulp NEPA, where a project includes, you know, a variety of things that, you know, there's timber production, there's stream restoration, there's road decommissioning, there's, you know, maybe some other habitat goals. And I don't know if that shift away from that is a direction from on high, you know, like say, you know, under Trump administration, goals maybe have shifted that away. So that, you know, the NEPA really is meant to focus on, you know, the board feet goals or what, but I see that as a challenge. I mean, on the SAIS law for years, you know, the environmental analyses that were coming out were based around sub-watersheds that included, you know, all sorts of restoration from plantation thinning to in-stream. And even there, I've seen a bit of a shift away from that. And I personally like, you know, having all of those things combined. I understand how it can get unwieldy, but it also shows that, or essentially then those projects are approved, you know, when, you know, maybe the collaborative can help with finding partnerships to help fund those non-commercial projects, but the NEPA is done at least. And so you know that you can move forward when there's the capacity to do it. but I've seen a shift away from that. And then, also with categorical exclusions, they're, very narrowly focused, and that doesn't necessarily lend itself to collaboration because of the way the public process doesn't happen. Yeah. Tiana or Laura, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I'll jump in. I definitely agree with most of what has been said, or pretty much all of it. I definitely think that the timing pressure can create a lot of challenges, right? When you're trying to rush on these big, complicated projects that require in-depth conversation, things can get really challenging, right? You don't have the opportunity to fully discuss what is necessary. And with that is also the issue with capacity within collaboratives, right? Collaboratives are volunteer. Not everybody on the boards are necessarily paid. Not everybody that participates. So having the capacity for everybody to come in and actually spend the time to deep dive into some of these issues can be incredibly challenging. I think that sometimes that focus on or that condition-based management can be a big challenge. That was mentioned as well earlier. So when you don't know the total exactly what's happening on the project, it's really hard to spend the time to contrast that with your zones of agreement or principles to say like what are going to be the outcomes here, what are going to be the actual effects. And without that information, that can be incredibly challenging. We don't even know what exactly is going to happen on the project until later in the process. Because of that, there's that lack of, and maybe that's a little bit of like give and take with control on the project between the collaborative and the agency, but it can be incredibly challenging. Having board feet goals or board feet essentially be the measurement sometimes of the agency can be incredibly challenging, because that's, it's an easy metric, right? But if that's all you're using to measure it, at least that can help incentivize getting more board feet on a project, which is unfortunate because that's not all that we're looking for as well. CEs are also definitely something that can be challenging when you don't have the opportunity to collaborate early and often. Then you don't have the opportunity to produce good outcomes on the ground, and that's unfortunate. I guess we've tried to address those goals by one thing I wanted to say is being really clear on the principles and zones of agreement within the collaborative. So addressing that by, having good cohesion. That's not always easy, but I think that's an incredibly important component within collaboratives to make sure everybody's on the same page. And then you can act as one cohesive entity and kind of harness the power of that cohesion to help move forward. And as Laura was saying, help beat the drum, when she was talking about the last question, to say like this, be repetitive, keep talking about it, make sure that it's really clear that, this is going to happen within the project, whatever it may be.
Yeah, I was, talking about the big gulp projects. One of the challenges, maybe in a good way, specifically here, is that like specific watersheds have been identified as high priority for restoration. And so there's a lot of money coming from outside of the Forest Service to restore those streams. And that's a process that goes a lot faster than upland vegetation management project. And so those projects have not been a collaborative thing. There's a lot of agreement on what should be happening in there. But so what ends up happening is a lot of those good projects get implemented outside of the collaborative space. And then the collaborative is only dealing with the veg management projects and only dealing with the contentious issues. And I think that can start to drain on people and feel like, they would want to be involved in that stuff a little bit more, even if to just be able to feel like they have more of a participation in the stuff that, the organization really cares about. And so that, I think, has been a bit of a challenge here, just that this stuff is happening, but in a separate lane, and it's not involving people. And so it's very easy to get down on, you're only involved in the contentious stuff. And another thing, a couple of you have mentioned how you can find these zones of agreement, and that way you can move forward with either the understanding baked in or move forward as one. And one thing that has been a challenge here is that there is inconsistency in how things are implemented or understood across a particular forest. And so, an ID team can really work to build trust and gain that trust on that specific district. And they then, are able to do maybe some stuff that might be a little more scary in certain circumstances, but because of the trust that is built, it's okay. But that doesn't translate to another district. The ranger can set the culture of the districts. And so it's hard to build zones of agreement when you feel like, well, we know it's going to be implemented in this way here, but we have seen something different over here. And so we're not willing to say, yes, we agree to these types of conditions when, there's not a feeling of consistency. And I think, Forest Service leadership can take some accountability for that. There needs to be more consistency in how things are done within a specific forest.
And that's kind of a product of the size of the collaborative you're talking about, right? I mean, some of the rest of us are talking about, I guess, just one ranger district or just one county, or, and you're talking about multiple national forests, even.
Yeah.
So that I can see that as a challenge for sure.
And kind of on that as well, when I was within the Forest Service, what I observed was that, I mean, almost across the board, the people who work on the districts want to do the right thing for the land, but are often constrained by regulations and mandates that come from way, way high up. And so things that, people get frustrated about within the collaborative, letting fires burn on the landscape naturally. Those are things that I think there's a lot of agreement that, yes, we want to return fire to the landscape, but that is not a call that we can make. That's way higher up. And so, those types of things can influence the dynamics of collaboratives and feeling like a project has been successful, or, an amendment to a forest plan coming through, or, that's not stuff that the district people have control over. They just kind of have to work with it, but it can erode the trust within a collaborative.
Yeah, on those same lines, with stuff that's higher up, one of the things is the capacity of specialists like wildlife biologists and fisheries biologists on the forest to actually help drive the project, right? Everybody has their own responsibilities, and to have the capacity to do more than just respond to what the silviculture is and driving the project, I've heard can actually be incredibly difficult to spend the time to help develop those ideas. And the collaborative, in a way, can help increase that capacity by being that voice, by being that advocate, by saying this is incredibly important to move forward, and to say this needs to be a priority in this instance. One other thought that I had is that one of the challenges is that sometimes in projects I've seen that things are thrown out of a project just because there's a thought that there may not be the capacity later to do that. And so then it's not analyzed as part of the project, and then there's not the opportunity to do it at all. And so I like to be to push for a little bit more optimism. And for example, to say like, look, we want to do 15,000 acres of landscape level prescribed burning on this project. But even though we're told like there's no way this is ever going to get done, I want to be more optimistic and say, look, we need to analyze for this and actually put this in there, because what if things change? Prescribed burning for a project isn't going to happen until 5 to 8 years after the decision is signed in some instances, right? Because it's one of the last things that's done as part of the project. So maybe policy can change. Maybe we can change change the guidelines to make sure that we can actually get this done, whether it's air quality standards or whatever it may be.
Great thoughts, you all. I wanted to add maybe one more thing on challenges and how we could address them. And I think Michael may have touched on this a bit, but the easiest thing is to measure acres treated and board feet produced, right? I mean, and yes, that is for the last several years been the metrics that the Forest Service has been asked to measure, but that direction also it comes from the state level. But those aren't necessarily the only outcomes we want to see. So actually, I mean, so doing the non-commercial non-commercial generating sort of projects on the ground is one thing, and having funding for that, but then actually measuring them so we can point to success or learn from, you know, what we did is really challenging. And on the Siuslaw National Forest, because we had a robust stewardship contracting collaboratives, and they don't like it when I call it a program, but stewardship contracting program, it's just the easiest thing to say. On that forest, we had unique partnerships available for doing that sort of monitoring and measuring, and made it a priority of the stewardship groups to produce reports and work with a contractor to actually measure all of the things that we were doing. And I'm going to share my screen one more time to show you this slide that I just screenshotted out of one of our reports from 2017, where we measured both biophysical accomplishments, and this is just of the stewardship contracting that was going on the National Forest, as well as socioeconomic monitoring. So, you know, where was money being earned in the various counties that were involved, how many taxes were going back to the state, how many jobs were produced. I mean, it took a lot of work to get that information, actually, and it took a private contractor to do it, because it's not something that the Forest Service monitors for at all. But it's really helpful information for knowing whether we're accomplishing, you know, our on the ground goals of things like invasive species controlled and stream habitat being restored and roads being decommissioned, but also what sort of benefits we're having to, you know, our communities. And, you know, if we want to be able to measure success in those ways, we have to measure them. And again, like I said, it's really hard. And in this case, we had a solid partnership with the National Forest where they were able to pitch in some money to cover this, but also working with partners in the collaborative to help fund this sort of measurement work. But I know that that's not the case everywhere, and can be really difficult to find. So, all right, any other thoughts on some challenges or rising above? Well, so, you know, those challenges to achieving conservation goals can be pretty big and frustrating, especially if you're coming at it from, just an environmental lens. So I want to ask, how has your organization, and maybe this doesn't apply to you, Laura, but considered leaving a collaborative because you weren't, seeing the results, or those challenges were kind of seen as too big? And then how has your collaborative dealt with any groups, in particular environmental groups, leaving the collaborative, and how has it affected the group?
So we have not considered leaving, and we haven't had a group leave the Northeast Washington Forest Coalition, but we have had some conflicts within the collaborative, of course. And I think the best way to, I guess I'm not answering the question, but the best way to deal with it, but that's okay, is to continue to, in our case, to go back to the ground rules of the collaborative, to say, like, look, we're here for constructive discourse. We're here to listen to other people. We're here to listen, to understand, to consider the interest of others as our own, and to give the opportunity for everybody in the collaborative to have their voice heard and to find solutions for that. I think there's been extra challenges as part of the pandemic, just to call that out, because in-person collaboration is so much easier. Communication is, primarily nonverbal. And so when you're on Zoom or you're on the phone, it's not exactly the same. And communication is obviously the key component of collaboration. And so that can be incredibly challenging to do. I think it's one of the important solutions for making sure that doesn't happen is actually spending the time to, enumerate the conservation benefits that we see, like you just showed, right? To actually to have those in place, to be able to look at those and say, like, look, we have actually accomplished something. Sometimes it can feel like we haven't gotten anywhere, we're sliding backwards, whatever it may be. But then you take a step back and you look and say, like, look, we've actually accomplished quite a bit over the last 20 years or whatever it may be. And yeah, I think it's continually taking the time to build those relationships. It's an ongoing process. You can never really stop.
Yeah, definitely agree with all that. I feel like I have more questions about the impact of leaving the collaborative groups than maybe direct experiences or answers to what would happen. You know, we have temporarily left a couple of our collaborative groups at times for specific reasons. It hasn't happened for quite a while now, quite a number of years. We did see the most recent experience I can recall, we did actually see, and this wasn't us leaving, we did see Oregon Wild and I think Pacific Rivers Council leaving the Clackamas Stewardship Partners around the same time. And that definitely, like, it put more heat on us as we kind of brought forward our concerns and recommendations with projects. And it was hard, but I'm really glad that we stuck with it because I could really see things moving a lot differently direction-wise, at least in the collaborative, if BARC wasn't at the table during those times. But then I also know that, like, Oregon Wild, you all continued to comment on the projects that collaborative was talking about. And so I sometimes wonder kind of what level of influence that those comments may have had in the advocacy that you all were doing on the same projects we were collaborating on, even though they came, you know, kind of outside the collaborative process. And that's always just been a big question to me because I've heard even, you know, longtime project planners for the Forest Service say that they don't always give the collaborative input more weight than a comment by an individual in the public. You know, it can sometimes be more based on what that comment and that input contains. Not saying that that's right, but I've definitely heard that shared in the past. And so that's always begged the question to me, you know, where does all this hard work go? You know, we sometimes get into these really, really divisive, hard topics, and it can feel really disempowering sometimes not to see all that hard work translated into something that you know, individuals on the group want to see. So I guess kind of more questions than answers on that one. The one experience we left the Hood River group, I think back in like 2013 or 14. It was kind of right as I was coming on. And so I'm not really sure how that affected things in the short term, but it definitely sent a message to the rest of the group about the reasons why and kind of what we were observing. And I think Oregon Wild definitely had our back with us too at the time. And I know folks that they still remember that who were there. And but we did end up coming back to the group a year or two later. And yeah, so yeah, that's my piece.
It's interesting. I mean, there's a variety of reasons why groups might leave. Some of it might be, you know, you're not seeing the benefits that you want to, you know, as far as project design or whatever. But some of it's capacity. I know that for some of the groups that Oregon Wild has left for a while over the years has been a capacity issue. I mean, it takes a lot of time to do collaboration. And so you do have to weigh, you know, that time and commitment and, you know, drain on staff with the benefits that you're getting. And sometimes you might still get great benefits out of collaboration, but that balance wasn't quite working for your bottom line or whatever. So it might not always be, you know, because you're frustrated. It might be because, you know, you just need to focus your staff in another place. I know, I mean, you mentioned, you know, Oregon Wild kind of coming and going from some of the Mount Hood collaboratives, and I truly think most of that was capacity based, but we have left other collaboratives based on some, you know, ideological differences and some of the challenges we've been discussing. I'm not going to dwell on those because I don't have personal experience. I did leave the Mackenzie Watershed Stewardship Group on the Willamette National Forest a year and a half or so ago. After making those, you know, sort of calculations in my head about whether we were seeing the ecological outcomes improved through our participation. And I couldn't, and we had a fundamental difference of opinion between of values for stewardship contracting and the way it was being used. And I feel like, I felt bad about leaving. I hung on for a long time when I didn't really enjoy it. But I feel like the group respected the decision and understood. And I think that some of the work that I had done there kind of stuck with the group as far as their considerations moving forward. So I think it was a decent parting of ways. I know that doesn't always happen. I'll just mention on the SAIS law, there's been these stewardship groups for years and years, and now we're forming a new forest-wide collaborative that will tackle issues outside of stewardship contracting. And there's several conservation and environmental groups involved, but there has been over the last few years sort of an erosion of trust that was built with the National Forest on some projects, on some issues. And so those conservation groups involved in the formation of this new collaborative are, I would say, skeptical and, but hanging in there as far as wanting to rebuild that trust, wanting to build relationships so that we can see the outcomes on the ground that we all, want to see. We want to see forest and watershed restoration. So I'm hopeful and, taking kind of all of the good thinking of past collaboratives. We have a good facilitator, good buildup of process. I'm hoping that we can ensure that, conservation voices remain at the table because we're going to get those intangibles as well as the on the ground stuff. But it's, it can be a challenge to sort of rebuild trusts once it's been eroded.
Yeah, I was thinking about Michael's point about, does the collaborative have any more weight than the comment during the comment period? And on the one hand, that could be seen as a good thing. The NEPA process is there and the Forest Service needs to consider the comments that are put forward, and those help to drive alternatives that are developed. But, the big benefit of the collaborative, and this is kind of to your point, Chandra, is the relationships that you can build, the personal relationships that you can build within them, which can be very important. And so that hopefully, to me, the ideal situation is that the collaborative, through zones of agreement or working directly on the project development, the proposed action is one that the collaborative is already on board with, and that you would see your issues already addressed in that. And then any comments that come in that drive the alternative development are going to be something outside of what the collaborative has already discussed. But, the Northern Blues saw two groups leave and, they put out their statements as to why. And I can only speak personally that I'm bummed. I'm sad that they're not there. And I do, you don't want to run the risk of having an echo chamber. If everybody, who dissents leaves, then you're not going to get the product that you actually want. And so, I'm sad and they had their reasons for it, and we'll see what happens in the future, but it is absolutely too bad that it got to that point. And that kind of goes back to some of the challenges I was talking about, because I felt like a decent amount of that was out of the control of a lot of the people who were participating in the collaborative. It was larger things that were happening. But yeah, when you don't have those voices, yes, the comments matter. They're part of the NEPA process. And so they absolutely still have the opportunity to comment and be heard, but it does miss the relationship building. But if you don't feel like you are building the relationships, then maybe it isn't worth still being there.
Thanks for that perspective, Laura. We've already touched on some of the possible ways of that collaboratives can sort of preempt some of these challenges, right? And so I guess let's continue down that road to wrap things up. I mean, we've talked about getting buy-in and desired ecological outcomes sort of built into the purpose and need from an early stage, having diverse voices represented in that early on, like that seems like a key one that everyone's mentioned as being really important to to ensure that ecological goals are going to be met, and having ways of measuring and showing off those outcomes is another one. Another one that I thought of is, and it kind of goes with the sort of seeing for yourself what benefits you're getting. And somebody else mentioned how important, field work is, but, just on the ground sort of monitoring, or just, field trips. I'm speaking like monitoring with like a little M. Going out and seeing stuff on the ground can, I think, really assuage some of the concerns that environmental groups have for certain projects. I know on the Siuslaw National Forest, the constraints under the Northwest Forest Plan make it so you can't make large openings in plantations or elsewhere. And the largest you can make is a half an acre in a reserve. And that sounded really big to me before actually going out on the ground to see what a half an acre looked like with a couple trees left within it. It's not that big. And it really didn't seem to, be outside the norm of what you would see in any, healthy forest with diverse structure. And so it seemed in line with, what we were trying to do. But, we could have debated that for several meetings without going to see it on the ground and find some agreement. So just a plug for more field work together to discuss some of the, trickier issues. And it's probably a no-brainer for anyone who's been in the collaborative, but wanted to throw that out there as one thing that collaboratives can do more of. If anyone wants to throw any other sort of solutions out there.
I'll just say along that same vein is developing trust between all parties. Like that's you do that through going out in the field and looking on the ground and seeing actually what's going on. So that's an important component of how to, that doesn't specifically address the concerns, but if you do that, then both parties, develop that rapport and you start, sharing your interest and moving from there. I think this has been mentioned before, but like even before, like getting it into the purpose and need a little bit, being really clear about like what your ecological objectives and goals actually are within the collaborative. So having those foundational zones of agreement and stuff like that is an important like precursor component to make sure that everybody is really clear on what you want, having the capacity and taking the time to like do a pre-field trip meeting. So hopefully most people within the collaborative are generally on the same page, can be really valuable to make sure that you're meeting those conservation goals. So conservation communicating with the timber partners within the collaborative to say like, these are our interests, these are our concerns. And then you can kind of almost like switch roles when you're out in the field, talking to the agency and say like, well, my timber partners have this interest, or, they can say my conservation partners have this interest in this project. So you have those opposite voices speaking up for the interests of their collaborative members can be really valuable.
Yeah, and I'll jump in. I think, what Chandra shared about the long-term, like landscape strategic planning that was done on the Willamette National Forest, that's gotten me really excited to advocate for that type of thing. On the Mount Hood National Forest, I think, that would probably involve meeting with forest leadership, probably with the forest supervisor, and they do hold a lot of influence on kind of the level at which their staff interacts and the stages at which they interact during the planning process with the collaborative groups. I think it seems like for the Mount Hood that would need to shift. And also it's been said, but yeah, really keeping that communication open and regular with Forest Service specialists and leadership who have lots of ideas for projects and in terms of the funding issue, I really do think that, and this might be harder for some collaboratives than others, but if they're determined, I do think that collaboratives can work together to try to pool resources to pursue like alternate or, you know, less sought after funding to be able to do some of the work that they want to do, or at least like a place at the table when those opportunities come up, you know, like the grants, like the Drinking Water Providers Partnership is an example, or, you know, I know there's been all this money generated allocated recently through, you know, legislation like the, you know, Great America Outdoors Act. And, you know, I know that's resulted in National Forest having money to spend on things like recreation opportunities and infrastructure that they're kind of like being tasked to identify now. So, you know, I think maybe advocating for more involvement in those kinds of discussions might get us more of what we want. But I really also do think that there's kind of also this underlying issue of just kind of the membership and like approachability and accessibility of these groups. I really think that just based off of the timing in which they meet and what's being talked about and the level at which it's being talked about, I really think these groups can start to feel pretty exclusive and kind of like an echo chamber, like was mentioned. Some of them, I think, probably more than others. And so I really think working to identify some ways to bring more voices in is going to be really beneficial, since, you know, honestly, most of the groups that started out in these collaboratives were there because they were talking about timber sales, and you know, that's a lot of the same groups are still there for that reason. And so I think if we can tip the scales a little bit in terms of what are the desired conversations that people want to be having, and what are people's outcomes, I think that we could get some pretty different outcomes on the ground too. So those are my initial thoughts.
Yeah, on that last point, I guess one thing I wanted to mention was, I mean, it'd be great to see that the Forest Service and the collaboratives as entities really should make a commitment to ensuring that environmental voices are valued and heard and at the table, along with other diverse interests. But, you know, and then to commit to not moving forward without those voices, and maybe admit that your collaborative might not be legitimate without them even. And, you know, like by setting sort of that baseline of like, no, this is important to us to have this variety of voices, then, you know, then those voices might not feel marginalized. And again, that could go for any interest group. But since we're talking about, you know, conservation voices, I just want to put that out there. I wholeheartedly agree with you, Michael, on the funding stuff. And, you know, it's whether it's, finding outside partnerships, grants, et cetera, but also, working at those higher levels on the, you know, the budget and where money is coming from the federal government. I don't know how to do that, but I know there are people who do work on that, and including at Sustainable Northwest. So that would be awesome to see some changes coming from on high.
Yeah, another note on the higher level stuff. I think that the collaborative acknowledging those higher level issues, say, for example, initiatives like condition-based management or the use of the large scale timber-oriented categorical exclusions to hopefully weigh in on how those are causing issues at the project level, and either use the collaborative voice or, you know, work with partners to help change that at the higher level if necessary to accomplish this conservation type work on the ground. I think acknowledging like how much pressure those can really have at the forest level and at the project level can have is important, and then taking actionable steps to hopefully change them, which is a little bit outside of collaborative control, but, you know, you can work with others to make sure that it happens ideally.
Great. Well, thank you all for that's the formal question part, but we've got some great questions that have come in from the participants. So I'm going to triage them a little because I know we only have about 10 minutes left before we move to the hangout part of this panel. And I guess one that I'll start with is really specific, and then I'll go to some a little bit broader ones. But how can younger and emerging collaboratives interact with Fish and Wildlife, I think, service? What helps with long-term consultation and relationship success? And Laura, I think that's very pointed towards you.
Ooh, gosh, that's an interesting question. Can you read that again?
Yeah, how can younger and emerging collaboratives, so I guess early stage, interact with Fish and Wildlife, and what helps with long-term consultation and relationship success? So those are, you know, relationships are a little bit more in the collaboration realm, and consultation is, you know, more of a formal thing, but I guess can one help with the other? That might be a good question.
Yeah. And, you know, so where I work, which is on the east side, there's a lot less going on in terms of listed species than on the west side. So understanding I work with a much less complicated system for the service over here. But I think, I mean, well, you know, the question is about the collaborative itself, but I think the service is starting because historically, the service hasn't participated that much on collaboratives, both because of capacity and because, like I said, you know, there is a responsibility for the action agencies to consult with us. So we do get our voices heard regardless. But I do think there's more of an awareness that these are important things to be sitting at and have our voices heard consistently on things. And so, you know, number one, if it's a group that's part of the collaborative, just simply reaching out to whichever field office is there is number one. And, you know, figuring out where the common interests are. And that, I mean, potentially that kind of goes back to what we were just talking about in terms of one thing that I have found with the government is suddenly there's money out of nowhere. And if you don't have something shovel ready, it can get wasted or it's going to go to something else. And so this sort of like shuttle diplomacy, not necessarily big C within the collaborative meeting, but if the groups can either work with the specialists or the service or ODF&W to identify those projects, that wish list of projects, when suddenly funding comes available, that makes it a lot easier for that stuff to happen, if that makes sense. And so, you know, finding sort of the intersections of concerns and resources and issues can really help down the road as suddenly, oh, we've got this funding that we can use for, you know, bull trout or Western bumblebee habitat restoration or something like that. And if the groups have already talked about it, it's way easier to move forward. And again, you know, and that also goes back to capacity though, is how much time does everybody have to, you know, compile these wish lists of things. But yeah, I mean, honestly, I feel like it really is just direct connecting to the people who are the players in the area. And once you start talking, you figure out all the common grounds. But yes, to that point too, on the relationship, you know, if it's like a bull trout stream, there's been restoration done on it. We understand that the Forest Service doesn't have the capacity to do the types of monitoring that we necessarily would want on there. You know, having other groups available to, you know, create little side groups of, yeah, we went out and we looked at it and this is what it looks like. I think that actually does help, you know, successful consultation into the future. I don't feel like I really answered that, but I mean, it is something that we're struggling with right now, you know, treating within our HCAs, and, you know, we have kind of the programmatic stuff that's set up and it can be difficult to move beyond that. But the more that our environmental group partners understands our existing constraints and what they would like to see, then we can start moving forward with that kind of stuff.
Well, you might not have totally answered the question, but I just the response anyway, so it's okay. This is I'm skipping one of the questions on the list because what your answer prompted, I don't know, my brain to connect these two, but someone asked, can we speak to road bumps that come during implementation? And how can the Forest Service and collaboratives course correct projects that aren't meeting stakeholder expectations, and learn from that need to course correct, so that broken trust doesn't roll over into future projects. Sorry, the monitoring, I think, is what spurred that. There's because in my mind, having fairly frequent monitoring and reporting is one way of catching things before they maybe get too far outside of what your agreements are. But there has to be a mechanism for that course correction, and I've seen some resistance by the agency to do that sort of adaptive management in the moment, or for the very next project that maybe has already started the NEPA process, and so some of that might be the constraints of the agency, like kind of the way that you line up planning, but I don't want to use that as an excuse either. I mean, if your collaborative group is monitoring a project in implementation and you find that a prescription is like really not getting the results that you expect, but the project that's going through NEPA right now with the collaborative's input is using that same prescription, there's got to be a way to course correct quickly, because it's true, then you could lead to broken trust. And this is exactly one of the things that happened in the SAIS law that we're trying to fix right now. I don't know. So I'm open to other answers to that question, and ways of addressing that. No one's dealt with that before.
I mean, I think you're right on the money. Like, monitoring is really how you deal with it. And I think the collaborative could put more pressure on the Forest Service about how important post-treatment monitoring is, because you're right, the way that it happens is that next project is getting planned before implementation has even necessarily started on the past one. And it's very easy to move on without making sure that what you thought was going to happen is happening. And yeah, that I think just the collaborative making it clear that this is how you build trust, is you're actually doing what you said you're going to be doing. But capacity and funding, and that's what it all comes to.
Yeah. So another great question. We talked a little bit about this as far as the higher level stuff, but the question says, timber and fuels are targets that come from the highest levels of the Forest Service leadership. So what would we want to communicate to the incoming Forest Service chief about other important outcomes that we want to measure? Do we have ideas for specific metrics that measure success for the Forest Service other than acres and board feet?
So this is Tiana, my phone.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, sorry, my internet dropped. Welcome to rural America. I guess instead of specific metrics, I would say the message would be more that it's important to actually have other metrics besides acres and board feet, helping essentially drive, not necessarily drive projects, but essentially be the measurement that is used to measure success for projects, to make sure that it actually happens, right? So it's stuff like culverts replaced, road miles restored or obliterated, or whatever it may be. It's wildlife habitat improvements on the landscape. It's large woody debris in streams or beaver dam analogs. Having those specific metrics are important, and taking some of the emphasis off of board feet specifically is the most important component. Making sure that's not the driver of projects, making sure that it's not the incentive for Forest Service districts to actually, harvest more board feet. Yes, getting important, like restoration on the ground is important, is an important metric, and that's hard to do without measuring acres and board feet, but it doesn't need to be what feels like a lot of the time is the only metric or the major metric.
I mean, the things I want to communicate to, you know, the new leadership are, I don't know how to measure, honestly, you know, like how is our management contributing to, you know, addressing climate change or resiliency in the face of fire, or, you know, those really kind of really hard things to measure. So I agree that and that should be goals of the Forest Service, in my opinion. You know, we want to set those lofty goals around sort of hard issues, but that really are important for our public lands. So out of those, maybe those specific metrics, you know, can be developed, but I'm not totally sure what they are. I mean, you know, measuring snags and down wood is one thing, but I don't know, and they're important components that we want to make sure we're getting on the landscape with our work. But do they contribute to, you know, those bigger picture issues for public lands? And I'm not sure what to measure for that. It's really hard.
Yeah, I agree that, you know, there were metrics that were previously used by the Forest Service that were somewhat helpful, you know, like miles of stream restored or miles of roads decommissioned, acres of wildlife habitat restored, and that kind of thing. But it's true that I think a lot of what we want to see doesn't necessarily fit under those kind of quantitative categories. Yeah, what Chandra just said about climate change and climate adaptation, that's something that is really of interest to me. You know, with the Mount Hood and the Willamette and the Columbia River Gorge Scenic Area, they just released their climate change vulnerability assessments, and, you know, have staff working on compiling climate change adaptation strategies. And, you know, it's not, they don't have specific direction through those assessments to integrate that. But I think there is some expectation that they do, and I think that they could use some help integrating those findings and recommendations in the forest planning. And it could be a tool that collaboratives could use to try to get more, I guess, climate savvy or whatever projects done on the ground. And it could be a metric in the way that the collaboratives could do a better job at, you know, putting the question out there to the Forest Service, like, how are these projects that we're working on together incorporating climate mitigation, and what is like an itemized list of actions that the agencies are taking to be able to move more towards that? Because I agree that that's one of the largest and most important endeavors that the agency has on its plate right now. And it's relatively new, at least for the agency, to be like thinking about it in that way. So yeah, I think that would probably be my number one quote unquote metric that's not really a metric.
Well, sorry, we have to make these suggestions to the highest levels, and I mean, it's above our pay grade, right? So they have to make the hard decisions on how to trickle that down to the ground. Well, we've hit 11:30, so I'm going to have to not get to all the other great questions, but thank you all for submitting them. And thank you, Michael, Laura, and Tiana for participating in this. You all had really great insights, and I hope they were helpful or thought-provoking to all of you listening out there. So thanks to Sustainable Northwest for putting on this workshop as well. And there's lots of other great ones coming up, I'm sure.
Thanks, Chandra, and thanks everyone for participating. That was a really great discussion. So a couple things to wrap up. I'll share my screen quick. There we go. So our next webinar in the series is on June 23rd. It's lessons learned comparing survey results from 3 pilot restoration projects in Eastern Washington. Lloyd McGee from the Nature Conservancy will be presenting. For more information on this series and to sign up to receive email updates, visit our website. And if you have any other questions, or if your question didn't get answered today, if anything comes up, please feel free to reach out to me. My contact information is at the bottom there. You'll also receive a post-webinar email in the next 48 hours or so with the recording for today's workshop, as well as a survey to provide your feedback. We'd really like it if you could take a couple minutes just to let us know your thoughts on how it went so that we can improve for next year. And also the participant list for today so that you're welcome to reach out and connect with one another. With that, I do want to make sure that people have the opportunity at least to connect with one another. These are not facilitated. This is up to you if you want to take some time and talk to one another. Think of it as a very informal hallway conversation. You'll have about 15 minutes to participate, and you should get a, let's see, I'll do this one more time. You should get a little prompt at the bottom of your screen that that asks you to join a breakout room or choose a breakout room. And you're welcome to choose whatever you want. This is your time. Thanks everyone for coming.
Recording stopped.